Hello and welcome to Dateline London. Is Britain's policy on Afghanistan on the wrong track? What can the G20 really achieve on the world economy? And 70 years ago this week, World War II began. Why does it retain such a huge grip on our imagination? Here to discuss it are Thomas Keelinger of Die Welt, Stryker Maguire of Newsweek, Nazanin Ansari of Iran's Kayan, and Ned Tempko of The Observer. Good to see you. Well, amid continuing reports of widespread fraud in the Afghan presidential elections, is NATO backing the wrong person in Afghanistan in Hamid Karzai? And with the resignation this week of a minor British government supporter, a former army officer, Eric Joyce, over Afghan policy, is it time for a major rethink? What we got this week was Gordon Brown articulating, as clearly as some people would hope, perhaps, why we should be in Afghanistan. Did he get away with it?
Probably just barely, but not for long is the answer, because he's got two big problems. One is Hamid Karzai, whom, when the intervention began, was presented to the Western world as the wonderful, democratic, nation-building face of a new Afghanistan. And what we've seen in the worst possible manner in the last few days, and even more recently with fresh BBC reports, is an incredibly corrupt election, it appears. Huge differences within Afghanistan. And problem two is military, and that is people are dying, civilians are dying, but also soldiers in the key NATO powers on the ground, and that is Britain and the United States. And at some stage, both governments, but Gordon Brown in particular, is going to have to deal with what seems to be lagging or disappearing support on the ground here for the sacrifices being made in Afghanistan.
Nazanin, I suppose, well, there's so many parts to this, but one, to pick up the Karzai point, I mean, if part of what has been happening in Afghanistan is some attempt at nation building, then that nation building isn't going very well if British and American and other soldiers are dying on behalf of a regime which is seen as quite corrupt.
I mean, armies cannot build nations, and foreigners cannot build, nations. It is up to the Afghanis. And this is, I think, where Hamid Karzai has failed. Because after so many years in power, yes, of course, he was the savior, he was considered the savior, but he's become his ego has grown as the years have passed by. And he is now, I mean, you look at a nation like Afghanistan, of course it has had hundreds and thousands of years of history behind it, and you cannot suddenly change an entire culture. What that culture needs is perhaps a legal framework where people, the civil society, those who are interested in a modern, progressive country, to become involved in it. But instead of doing that, for example, we saw Mr. Karzai accepting this law that, basically gives half of the right to women and sends them back in. I mean, I think it is Mr. Karzai's fault that he hasn't done as much as he could have done.
Pursue some other things, but I mean, isn't that part of the problem? You're trying to build, apparently, a nation, for instance, with a police force of whom 70% of the recruits are illiterate, who cannot read the laws they're trying to enforce. So, I mean, the starting point is not the same as the starting point in Iraq, for example, a very civilized country with a very strong culture and formerly a very strong centralized government. It's a very different kind of place.
It is a different kind of place, but we have seen it happen. I mean, if there is a will and determination by the leaders by Afghani leaders, not by Western leaders, but by Afghani leaders, and their head has been Mr. Karzai, to really develop the country. I mean, right now, 40% of Afghanis live below the poverty line. 75% of Afghanis are under the age of 35, and 40% unemployment. Of course, this is breeding ground for fanaticism, and this is what Mr. Karzai has failed to do.
Thomas, obviously we know that the German election's coming up very soon, towards the end of this month. How far is foreign policy part of the discussion there, and how far do people fear that perhaps pressure on Ms. Merkel might produce a different role from German troops in Afghanistan? Because obviously many Americans would like that.
It's come to the fore this very week after the mishap in Kunduz, when a German command on the ground called for an airstrike. That has brought into sharp relief the problem that Germany faces as she thinks she's the third largest force, but not very much of a fighting force. And the British and Americans have begun to understand that they have to fight the enemy on the ground so as to reduce the risk for civilians and don't need to call airstrikes. Germans do not fight in the same vein, so they call airstrikes far too soon, and there you have the accident. That creates a huge uproar in my country where there's no appetite for the war, but they will have to face the music. We will all have to face the music in the NATO alliance, because this is an unequal burden sharing of the worst sort of kind. The Eric Joyce man you quoted, the aide to the British Defence Secretary who resigned, had a wonderful line in his resignation letter. He said, "Britain fights, Germany pays, France calculates, Italy avoids." I mean, if that is the truth of the matter, we are all responsible for losing the war, and we cannot shed crocodile tears about why we are not being able to confront the enemy. We are not doing enough ourselves. Germany is too. She has to confront it. It's not going to be resolved.
We'll get on to German history in a moment. We're talking about it, but I mean, you've got to confront that as well, haven't you? Because for obvious reasons, since World War II, Germany has been very reluctant for good reasons.
There's a huge amount of pacifism still very rampant in my country, also in Eastern Germany, where the military was a force for suppression and occupation, and they have to really begin to understand that wars can be fought to liberate people. Germans have always been on the wrong side of military exercises and military adventures. We've always been using militarism to suppress other people. So this is a philosophical debate, but it will not be resolved before the election, which is on the 27th of September, but the chicken will come home to roost, and Germany will have to face the music sooner or later.
I just think the problems are much more fundamental than all of these discussions that we're having about elections and polls in different countries. I mean, I think, first of all, I haven't seen enough evidence that leaders in Afghanistan, Afghani leaders, really want to get together as a real, proper nation state, number one. Number two, what is probably going to happen is we will attempt to make, by we, I mean the so-called West, will attempt to make this look better than it does now. Maybe it will be a new leader. And then within about 2 years, many NATO troops will be already out, and the rest will be coming out. And I think that the strategy that London and Washington right now are looking at really is the exit strategy. How do we get out in 2 years? Because they know it can't go on.
You see, and how do you get out regionally? I mean, because...
well, maybe you could do that. I mean, why do we have to pretend that Afghanistan is one single country when it barely functions as a single country?
But for instance, if you get out of Afghanistan with all the problems, what happens to the political situation in Pakistan? You know, what happens, ironically, even though there was great controversy about the war aims in Iraq, it's easy to forget that in fact, Afghanistan was the haven for al-Qaeda and the bombers at 9/11. So there is a kind of, there is a real connection between the threat and issue of terror and Afghanistan.
But there are other havens, too.
Yes.
I mean, that's the problem, is that al-Qaeda is an ideology, and the beliefs can go wherever they want to go. So already you have people in this country like Lord Malik Brown talking about Somalia as a haven for al-Qaeda. Other people are talking about ungoverned sectors of the Sahara. You know, what really, I'm not sure that argument works very well.
For the future, all these new havens that might potentially follow on. But I think this exit strategy talk is one talk directed at the gallery at home. You want to give people some sort of perspective. In the heart of hearts, I know perfectly well, you cannot quit and run. You cannot allow this area of the world to fall back into the hands of those people who are at liberty to plan and plot as they wish against you and me and everyone in the free world.